All right, let's kick off another deep dive. This time, we're tackling the Qin dynasty, specifically that infamous burning of books and burying of scholars episode.
Yeah, it's a really fascinating but complex period.
We've got these excerpts from a text focused on the first emperor of Qin. I think it might give us some fresh perspectives on what went down.
Oh, absolutely. There's a lot more to this story than the traditional narrative.
It's always full of twists, isn't it? Conflicting accounts, political drama, you name it. Get ready to have some assumptions challenged, folks.
Well, one thing that really stands out about the first emperor is his obsession with immortality. I mean, he poured resources into finding the elixir of life.
Really? Like he believed it was possible?
Absolutely. He supported all these alchemists like Sheng and Fu. They were on this quest for the impossible.
Wow. It's hard to imagine someone so powerful chasing something so unattainable.
Right. But these guys, these alchemists, they were basically promised the world. Lavish funding, the emperor's favor, anything they could ask for if they could just deliver this elixir.
It's a pretty tall order, to say the least. I mean, immortality isn't exactly something you cook up in a lab, right?
Definitely not. Even with ancient Chinese alchemy. So you can imagine what happened when they didn't deliver, despite all the support they got.
I bet the emperor wasn't too happy about that. What happened then?
Well, there were these two alchemists in particular, Sheng and Sheng. They started getting a little critical of the emperor, probably out of fear or frustration.
Criticizing the emperor? That seems like a risky move, no matter how frustrated you are.
For sure. Word got back to the emperor, as you can imagine, and he was not pleased.
I bet. That's got to be a recipe for disaster.
Yeah.
So what happened next?
This whole incident really set the stage for what we call the Shenyang incident. It's a really pivotal moment in the Qin dynasty, but it's been shrouded in mystery and controversy for centuries.
Oh, okay, so we're getting to the good stuff.
Yeah.
Xinjiang, right. What's so controversial about it?
Well, the traditional story, the one you often hear, is that the emperor, enraged by these alchemists betraying him, ordered the execution of hundreds of Confucian scholars.
Yeah, that's what I always thought, like a classic example of tyranny, trying to silence any opposition.
Right. But the source we're looking at actually challenges that whole idea. It suggests that the emperor's anger, while definitely fueled by the alchemists, might have been misdirected.
Oh, okay, so where does that leave us? If the victims weren't all Confucian scholars, then who were they?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? This source really makes you question the traditional narrative. So let's unpack this Shenyang incident a little more. In 212 BC, after the whole alchemist criticism thing, the emperor launched this huge investigation.
So he wasn't messing around?
No, not at all. He was furious, and remember, this is a guy who craves control. So this investigation, it wasn't just about finding the truth, it became this massive witch hunt.
Wow, a witch hunt. So things really got out of hand.
Definitely. People were accusing each other left and right. Paranoia was everywhere. And in the end, over 460 people were buried alive in Xianyang.
Buried alive? That's brutal.
It was. And the source we're looking at, it directly challenges the idea that these victims were all Confucian scholars. It suggests that the emperor's anger might have been directed at a much broader group of people.
Okay, this is where it gets really interesting, right? Because if it wasn't just Confucian scholars, then who were these people?
That's what historians are still trying to figure out. But the text does hint that the emperor's obsession with control went way beyond silencing any specific school of thought. He saw any dissent, any challenge as a threat, pure and simple.
I guess when you're on this quest for eternal life, anything that rocks the boat is a big deal.
Right. He was obsessed with maintaining power, with staying in control, and anyone who seemed like a threat, well, they paid the price.
It almost seems like this pursuit of immortality actually made things worse. It created this atmosphere of fear and suspicion, and that definitely doesn't sound stable.
Exactly. Shenyang was a turning point for the Qin dynasty. It marked the beginning of the end, both for the first emperor and his dream of an eternal empire.
It's fascinating how all these threads are connected, the obsession with immortality, the suppression of dissent, the brutal punishments. It's a lot to unpack.
Oh, absolutely. And we're just scratching the surface here. Remember those two big events we talked about at the beginning, the burning of books and the burying of scholars?
Yeah, they seem so intertwined, like two sides of the same coin.
Right, that's the common perception. But this source really challenges that. It argues that these were two separate events, each with its own motivations and consequences.
Wait, hold on. So you're saying that burning books and burying scholars weren't directly connected?
That's what this source is suggesting. It argues that the burning of books was most likely about getting rid of texts deemed subversive by the emperor.
Okay, so what does that mean exactly? Subversive texts. What would have been considered dangerous back then?
Think of anything that challenged the emperor's authority or promoted different political views or questioned his whole way of ruling. He wanted to control the narrative, make sure his version of things was the only one that mattered.
Ah, okay, so it was about silencing opposing voices, basically.
Exactly. And the source suggests that while Confucian texts were probably among those destroyed, The emperor's motives went beyond targeting any specific school of thought. It was about consolidating power, eliminating any potential challenges.
It's like when you're building a giant empire, you don't want any competing ideas floating around. Got to keep everyone on the same page.
Right. And this brings us to the burying of scholars, which, according to our source, was a direct consequence of that Shanyang incident we talked about.
So if it wasn't about the books, why did he bury all those scholars?
Well, remember the emperor's paranoia, his need for absolute control. The Shanyang incident, it started with those alchemists criticizing him, but it unleashed this wave of fear and suspicion that went way beyond those directly involved.
It's almost like he overreacted and things spiraled out of control.
Exactly. Our source suggests that the emperor's rage, which initially targeted those alchemists, went way too far. He ended up punishing anyone who even seemed like a threat, whether they were guilty or not.
So these scholars, they were basically collateral damage in all of this.
That's the argument the source is making. It's saying that this whole desire for immortality, this obsession with control, it backfired spectacularly.
Wow, that's heavy stuff. I'm already starting to see the Qin dynasty in a totally different light.
That's what's so great about digging into these sources, right? You start to realize how much more complex the story is than the version you learned in school.
I'm definitely hooked. I can't wait to see where else this deep dive takes us.
Oh, there's plenty more to explore. And I think you'll be especially intrigued by what this source has to say about the emperor himself. His personality played a huge role in all of this.
Okay, now you've really got my attention. Tell me more about this first emperor. What was he really like?
Well, our source doesn't sugarcoat anything. He's described as headstrong, totally obsessed with control, and he ruled through fear and punishment.
Yikes. It doesn't sound like the picture of a benevolent ruler seeking enlightenment or anything. Are there any specific examples in the text that really illustrate his personality?
Oh, for sure. One story that really stuck with me was about how he measured his daily workload. He literally weighed the official documents he had to go through, wouldn't stop until he hit a certain weight quota for the day.
Whoa, that's intense. You can just picture him with a scale,
Yeah.
meticulously weighing stacks of scrolls. Talk about control freak.
Yeah, exactly. And while this might have made him efficient in some ways, it also created this atmosphere where nobody dared to disagree with him.
I can see that. Who wants to speak up when they're being constantly monitored and measured like that? It's got to be suffocating.
Absolutely. And this brings us right back to those events we talked about earlier, the alchemists who dared to criticize him, the investigation that turned into a witch hunt, the mass execution in Xinjiang. It's all connected to this system built on fear and control.
It seems like the emperor's obsession with immortality, combined with this need for absolute control, it was like a recipe for disaster. It created this downward spiral that he couldn't escape.
You got it. It's a classic case of unintended consequences. The harder he tried to grasp immortality and control, the more unstable everything became.
This is also fascinating, and I feel like we're just getting started.
You're telling me. History is rarely simple. The more you dig, the more layers you uncover, and the more interesting it gets.
I can't wait to dive even deeper into this story. What other surprises are waiting for us?
Well, let's take a closer look at that Xianyang incident again. There's a detail there that's particularly intriguing, especially in light of what we've been discussing about the emperor's control issues.
All right, lay it on me. What detail are we talking about?
You remember we said that the Xianyang incident might have involved more than just Confucian scholars.
Yeah, you mentioned that the source hints at some of the victims actually being alchemists.
Exactly. There's evidence suggesting that some of the people buried alive in Xianyang were alchemists who had fallen out of favor with the emperor.
Wow, so even the people he was relying on to find the elixir of life weren't safe. That's pretty messed up.
It really shows how deep his paranoia ran. It wasn't just about open criticism. It was about anyone who might even harbor doubts or fail to meet his impossibly high expectations.
I guess when you're convinced you're going to live forever, any little setback feels like a betrayal.
Right. And remember, the whole Xianyang incident was triggered by those alchemists who criticized the emperor. It's not hard to imagine that others, under pressure to produce results, might have also expressed doubts or reservations.
And in the emperor's mind, even a whisper of doubt was probably seen as treason.
Exactly. Which leads us to something pretty interesting from the historical record. There's this quote from Prince Fusu, the emperor's own son, where he pleads with his father for mercy, saying that the people being punished are followers of Confucius.
Wait, but if our source is right, and the victims weren't all Confucian scholars, then what's going on there? Why would Fusu say that?
That's a great question, and it's one historians are still debating. It's possible Fusu was just trying to appeal to his father's sense of reason, reminding him that punishing scholars would destabilize the empire, damage his legacy.
Or maybe Fusu had his own motives. Maybe he was trying to protect certain people within the court, or saw this as a chance to score some points against his father.
Totally possible. That's what makes this period so fascinating. We're dealing with layers upon layers of interpretation. Even the historical records themselves might be biased or politically motivated. We got to be careful about taking things at face value.
So how do we even begin to separate fact from fiction when it comes to events that happened centuries ago? It feels like we're dealing with a puzzle with half the pieces missing.
You got to use critical thinking, question your assumptions, and consider all the different perspectives. History isn't just one single definitive story, It's more like a collection of narratives, interpretations, perspectives, all jumbled up like a big puzzle.
Oh, are we saying that there's no one truth when it comes to history?
In a way, yeah. We can never truly know exactly what happened in the past. All we can do is look at the evidence we have, consider the biases of those who recorded it, and then draw our own conclusions based on that.
It sounds challenging, but also really exciting. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about engaging with the past, trying to understand the people who lived through it.
Exactly. And by understanding the past, we can better understand the present and maybe even make better choices for the future.
I'm loving this deep dive.
Ah.
It's completely changing how I see the Qin dynasty and the first emperor.
That's what we love to hear. And we're not finished yet. There's still so much to uncover as we explore the impact of all this on Chinese history.
I can't wait to see where we go next.
Well, let's take a short break, and when we come back, we'll continue our journey through this incredible period of history.
We're back and ready to keep digging into this Qin dynasty puzzle. Before the break, we were talking about how those two big events, the burning of books and the burying of scholars, might actually be separate things.
Right, and as we learn more about the first emperor, it's clear that his need for control was a huge factor in pretty much everything he did. Like, it was at the core of his personality.
So we've got this emperor who's obsessed with control, terrified of losing power, and convinced he can find the secret to immortality. What happens after the Xianyang incident? Does he change his approach at all, or does he double down on everything?
Well, after Xianyang and all that book burning and silencing of dissent, things got even worse. There was this underlying tension throughout the Qin dynasty, and all this just brought it to the surface.
It's like he created a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? By trying to squash any threat, he actually made his position more vulnerable.
Exactly. He thought he was solidifying his power by getting rid of opposing voices, but really he was making it harder to see the problems that were brewing. He needed those different viewpoints, that feedback, even criticism, It's important for any leader, even back in ancient China.
Yeah, it's like that saying, those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. This emperor was so obsessed with controlling the future that he forgot to learn from the past.
You hit the nail on the head there. He couldn't learn from history, couldn't handle any disagreement, and in the end, that contributed to his downfall. He was trapped in this cycle of fear and control, and it blinded him to the real dangers.
Let's talk about the dynasty itself. How did all of this, the emperor's quest for immortality, the Xianyang incident, the suppression of any dissent, how did it affect the Qin dynasty's stability, its future?
The Qin dynasty, even though it unified China, it didn't last very long. It fell apart just a few years after the first emperor died. All that discontent that had been building up under his rule, it finally boiled over.
So even with this huge achievement unifying China, his legacy is more about a short-lived success followed by a rapid collapse. That's kind of sad when you think about it.
It is. It shows that true leadership isn't just about military power or political control. It's about inspiring people, bringing them together, governing with wisdom and compassion.
Sounds like the first emperor, for all his ambition and achievements, he missed that key part, that human element of leadership.
Yeah, he did some impressive things unifying the country, setting up a centralized government, but it was all overshadowed by his brutal methods, by his inability to create a system that could last beyond his own reign.
It's a lesson for any leader, really. You
Yeah.
can't just rely on fear and control forever. Those voices you try to silence, they'll find a way to make themselves heard eventually. And it's usually not pretty.
Exactly. The first emperor's story shows us that true leadership requires more than just strength and ambition. You need empathy. You need to listen to different opinions. You need to be able to adapt. Those are the things that build a lasting legacy, not fear and oppression.
This is really making me think differently about the Qin dynasty and the first emperor. There's just so much more to the story than what we usually hear.
That's exactly what we're aiming for with these deep dives. We want to challenge those familiar narratives, explore different perspectives, and encourage everyone to think critically about history. It's not just a bunch of facts and dates, it's a living, breathing conversation.
Before we move on, I want to circle back to something you said earlier about the Xianyang incident maybe involving more than just Confucian scholars. Our source even suggests some of the victims might have been alchemists themselves.
That's right. The source indicates that some of the people buried alive in Xianyang were alchemists who had lost the emperor's favor. It makes you wonder if the emperor's anger wasn't just directed at open critics, but also at anyone who might have had doubts or failed to live up to his impossible expectations.
Hold on a sec. Are we saying that the emperor might have accidentally executed some of the very people who were supposed to be finding him the elixir of life? That's just Wow, that's pretty ironic even for someone as paranoid as him.
It's definitely a possibility. Think about it. The whole Shanyang incident started with those alchemists criticizing him. It's not crazy to think that other alchemists, feeling the pressure to produce results, might have also expressed doubts or concerns.
Which, to the emperor, would have sounded like treason, even if they weren't actually plotting against him. His paranoia created a situation where just thinking the wrong thing was enough to get you killed.
You got it. And then there's this interesting tidbit from the historical records. The emperor's own son, Prince Fusu, he pleaded for mercy for those being punished, saying they were followers of Confucius.
But if our source is correct, and it wasn't just Confucian scholars who were buried, then Fusu's statement just raises more questions. What was he trying to do there?
It's a good question, and historians are still trying to figure it out. Maybe Fusu was just trying to reason with his father, reminding him that punishing scholars, no matter what they believed, would only hurt the empire in the long run.
Or maybe Fusu had his own agenda. Maybe he wanted to protect specific people in the court, or saw this whole thing as a chance to gain some power himself.
Could be. That's the challenge with studying this period. There are so many different ways to interpret things. Even the historical records might have been biased or influenced by politics. We can't take anything for granted.
So how do we, as people looking back from centuries later, how do we even try to figure out what really happened?
It's all about critical thinking. Question everything, look at all sides of the story. History isn't just one neat narrative. It's a collection of different stories, interpretations, and viewpoints. It's our job to piece it all together like a giant puzzle.
So there's no one right answer when it comes to history.
In a way, yeah. We can never truly know everything that happened in the past. All we can do is examine the evidence, think about the biases of the people who recorded it, and then draw our own conclusions.
It sounds like a tough job, but also really rewarding. It's not just about memorizing facts. It's about having a conversation with the past, trying to understand the people who lived through those events.
Exactly. And by understanding the past, we can get a better grasp on the present and maybe even make better decisions for the future.
This has been amazing. I feel like I've learned so much about the Qin dynasty, the first emperor, and everything surrounding the burning of books and the burying of scholars.
Glad to hear it. And we're not done yet. There's still a lot to unpack, especially when we look at the impact of all this on Chinese history.
I'm ready for more. What other insights are waiting for us?
Well, let's take a closer look at how the Qin dynasty ultimately fell apart. Remember, it was a short-lived dynasty, and the seeds of its destruction were sown during the first emperor's reign.
All right, let's do it. I'm ready to dive back in.
Great. We'll explore the aftermath of all these events, the emperor's legacy, and how the Qin dynasty's collapse shaped the course of Chinese history.
All right, we're back, and I'm ready to wrap things up with our Qin dynasty deep dive. We've been exploring this emperor's obsession with living forever, his iron grip on power, and those controversial events, the burning of books and the burying of scholars.
We've definitely challenged some of those traditional narratives, haven't we? Looked at the bigger picture and found some pretty surprising stuff along the way.
Absolutely. So now I'm thinking about the long-term effects of all this. How did the first emperor's reign and those policies, the ones we've been discussing, how do they impact the future of the Qin dynasty in China as a whole?
Well, remember, the Qin dynasty was short-lived, despite everything it accomplished. It crumbled just a few years after the first emperor died.
So even though he managed to unify China, it sounds like his legacy is more about a quick rise and a sudden fall.
Yeah, it's a pretty stark contrast, and it highlights something really important about leadership. Real power isn't just about brute force or silencing everyone who disagrees with you. It's about inspiring people, uniting them, and ruling with wisdom and a little bit of compassion.
It seems like the first emperor, even with all his smarts and ambition, he just missed that part. He was so fixated on controlling everything and outmaneuvering his opponents that he forgot to build something that could last.
His obsession with immortality and his inability to handle any kind of dissent, it all backfired in the end. It created this atmosphere of fear and instability that ultimately brought the whole thing crashing down.
It's a warning for any leader, really. You can't rely on fear and oppression forever. Sooner or later, those voices you try to silence will find a way to break free. And when they do, things can get messy.
That's the lesson of the first emperor's story, right? Real leadership is about more than just strength and ambition. It's about empathy, about being willing to listen, about adapting to change. Those are the qualities that leave a lasting mark, not fear and oppression.
This whole deep dive has been so insightful. I feel like I have a much better understanding of this period in Chinese history now.
I'm glad to hear that. Remember, history isn't just about memorizing names and dates. It's about understanding people, their choices, and the consequences that followed.
Okay, so we've explored the first emperor's reign, his quest for immortality, the burning of books, the burying of scholars, and the eventual collapse of the Qin dynasty. What are some key takeaways you'd want our listeners to walk away with?
I hope this deep dive has inspired everyone to question those traditional stories, to dig a little deeper, to look at things from different angles. History is rarely black and white. There are always shades of gray, and those nuances are what make it so interesting.
Yeah, that's a great point. We shouldn't just accept the stories we've been told without thinking critically about where they came from
Right.
and who might have benefited from telling them that way.
Right. And another takeaway is that power, when it's not balanced by ethics and compassion, it can be really destructive, not just for individuals, but for entire societies. The first emperor's story is a perfect example of that.
His obsession with control ultimately backfired, leading to the downfall of his entire dynasty.
Exactly. And finally, I hope this episode has encouraged everyone to keep exploring history, to keep asking those tough questions, and to be open to challenging their own assumptions. There are so many amazing stories out there just waiting to be discovered.
I couldn't agree more. So, to everyone listening, if this deep dive has piqued your interest, don't stop here. Keep researching, keep asking those questions, and who knows what other historical mysteries you might uncover.
And remember, approach history with an open mind, a critical eye, and a willingness to embrace the complexities of the human experience. That's where we find the most valuable lessons.
That's a perfect note to end on. Thanks for joining us on this journey through the Qin dynasty. We'll be back soon with another deep dive into a fascinating chapter of history. Until then, happy exploring.